The heavy doors of the throne room flew open with a crash that echoed through the stone halls. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Anne stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her dress torn at the hem, dust covering her shoes. Her eyes were wild with something between fury and desperation. The guards stepped forward immediately, hands moving to their weapons. But Anne didn't slow down. She strode across the polished marble floor, her footsteps sharp and deliberate. The nobles lining the walls whispered behind their hands. Some stepped back. Others leaned in, hungry for drama. Your Majesty. Anne's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. I demand an audience. Now. The king sat motionless on his throne, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the queen's face went pale. She gripped the armrest of her chair, knuckles white. One of the guards moved to block Anne's path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his left cheek. His name was Captain Davos, and he'd served the crown for 20 years. He raised his hand calmly. Lady Anne, he said, his voice low and steady. You cannot approach the throne in this manner. If you have business with His Majesty, you must submit a formal request. Her chest heaved. For a moment, it seemed like she might collapse right there, but then her jaw tightened. Her fists clenched at her sides. Formal request? She repeated, her voice trembling. My son is missing. He's been gone for 3 days. 3 days, Captain, and no one will tell me the truth. The room fell into a deeper silence. Even the whispers died. The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. Captain Davos didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been sympathy or guilt. Lady Anne, he began again, more gently this time. I understand your distress, but this is not the way. Then what is the way? Anne interrupted, her voice rising. I've gone to every official, every guard, every advisor. They all give me the same answer. We're looking into it. We'll notify you soon, but no one is doing anything. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. The king finally spoke. His voice was cold, measured. Anne, you are causing a disruption. Remove yourself from this hall, or you will be escorted out. Anne's breath caught. She stared at the king, disbelief washing over her face. A disruption, she whispered. My child is gone, and you call this a disruption? Captain Davos took a step closer. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, but his face was conflicted. He glanced back at the king, then at Anne. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. Anne saw it. That hesitation. That crack in his armor. You know something, she said, her voice barely audible now. Don't you? The captain's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the king once more. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on everyone. And then quietly, so quietly that only Anne could hear, Captain Davos said, Not here, before you find out what happens next. If you love emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that will move you. Anne's heart hammered in her chest. What did he mean? What did he know? And why couldn't he say it in front of the king? The doors behind her slammed shut. She was trapped now, standing in the center of the throne room with all eyes on her. The nobles watched like vultures. The queen looked away, and the king sat stone-faced, his gaze cold and unyielding. Captain Davos's hand hovered near his sword, but his eyes told a different story. They said, Trust me, wait. Anne didn't know if she could asterisk the king rose from his throne. The movement was slow, deliberate. It sent a ripple of unease through the room. When the king stood, it meant something. It meant a decision had been made. Anne, he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls, you have overstepped. Your grief does not give you the right to disrespect this court. Anne's hands trembled, but she held her ground. And your crown does not give you the right to ignore a mother's pain. Gasps erupted from the nobles. No one spoke to the king that way, not unless they were ready to face consequences. The king's expression darkened. You will leave now, or you will be removed. 2 more guards stepped forward, flanking Captain Davos. They were younger, less experienced. Their hands were already on their weapons, ready to drag her out if needed. But Captain Davos raised his hand, stopping them. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to hear her out. Lady Anne has always been loyal to the crown. If her son is truly missing enough," the king snapped. His eyes were sharp, dangerous. "You are a soldier, Davos, not an advisor. Do your duty." The captain stiffened. For a moment he stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Anne. His expression was hard now, the brief flicker of sympathy gone. "Lady Anne," he said formally, "you must leave the throne room." Anne's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to refuse to move until someone told her where her son was. But she saw it in the captain's eyes again. That silent message. It's not here. Not now. She took a shaky breath and nodded. "I'll go," she whispered. "But this isn't over." Captain didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the door. The 2 younger guards moved to escort her, but Davos held up a hand. "I'll take her," he said quietly. The king's gaze followed them, sharp and watchful. The queen still wouldn't meet Anne's eyes. As Captain Davos led her toward the massive doors, Anne felt the weight of every stare in the room. Judgment, pity, curiosity. It didn't matter. None of them understood. The doors opened, and the cool air of the corridor rushed in. Anne stepped through, and the heavy wood closed behind her with a final, echoing thud. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway was empty, lit only by torches flickering against the stone. Anne's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She felt like she might shatter. Captain Davos walked a few steps ahead, then stopped. He glanced down the corridor, making sure they were alone. Then he turned to face her. "Shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Anne's eyes blazed. "I don't care. My son is missing. Do you understand what that means? Every second I waste playing games with the crown is another second he could be." Her voice cracked. She couldn't finish the sentence. The captain's face softened. He looked older suddenly, tired. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry." Anne froze. "You know?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You know what happened to him?" Davos looked around again, his hand resting on his sword hilt out of habit. When he spoke, his voice was low, urgent. "I can't tell you here. The walls have ears. But yes, I know." Anne's heart lurched. Relief and terror crashed over her in equal measure. "Then tell me, please, is he alive? Is he safe?" The captain's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. "He's alive. But he's not safe." Anne's legs nearly gave out. She reached for the wall to steady herself. "Where is he?" "In the dungeons," Davos said quietly. Beneath the west tower, the world tilted. Anne stared at him, unable to process the words. "The dungeons." She whispered, "Why? What did he do?" The captain shook his head. "Nothing. He did nothing." "Then why?" "Because he saw something he wasn't supposed to see." Anne's blood ran cold. "What?" Davos hesitated. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. 3 nights ago, your son was in the library. He stayed late reading. He didn't know the king was holding a private meeting in the chamber next door. Anne's mind raced. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind that decides wars," Davos said grimly. "The kind that can't be witnessed by anyone outside the inner circle." Anne's breath caught. "And my son heard them, more than heard. He saw through a crack in the wall. He saw maps, plans, names of traitors within the court." Anne's hands flew to her mouth. "So they took him." "They had no choice," Davos said, though his voice was heavy with regret. "If word got out, it could collapse everything. The king ordered him locked away until the matter is resolved." "Resolved?" Anne's voice broke. "What does that mean? What are they going to do to him?" The captain's silence was answer enough. Anne's knees buckled. Davos caught her by the arm, holding her upright. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "There's still time. But you have to trust me." Tears streamed down Anne's face. "How can I trust anyone?" Because I have a son too, Davos said quietly. And if it were him, I'd want someone to help. Anne wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her chest ached. Her mind spun. But beneath the fear, something else began to rise. Determination. What do I need to do? She asked. Captain Davos glanced down the corridor again. Shadows danced on the stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed. He lowered his voice even further. Tonight, the king will attend the northern banquet. Most of the court will be there. The dungeons will be guarded, but not heavily. There's a shift change at midnight. That's when you'll have your chance. Anne's heart pounded. You want me to break him out? Not break, Davos corrected. Escort. I'll give you the key. You'll go in as a servant delivering food. No one will question it. And then what? Anne asked. Even if I get him out, where do we go? The king will hunt us down. You leave the city, Davos said. I have a contact at the eastern gate. He'll let you through, no questions asked. From there, you head to the border. Once you're across, you'll be beyond the king's reach. Anne stared at him. It sounded impossible, reckless. But what choice did she have? Let her son rot in a cell. Or worse. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. If you're caught, they'll execute you. Davos looked away. His jaw worked, as if he were choosing his words carefully. Because I've served the crown my entire life. I've done things I'm not proud of. Things I can't take back. He paused. But this? Locking up an innocent boy to keep a secret? I won't be part of that. Anne felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. She reached out and gripped his arm. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, then pulled a small iron key from his belt. He pressed it into her palm. This opens the cell in the lower east wing. Third door on the right. Memorize that. And Anne, he locked eyes with her. If anything goes wrong, you run. Don't look back. Don't try to fight. Just run. Anne closed her fingers around the key. It was cold and heavy in her hand. I will, she promised. Davos stepped back. Go home. Act normal. Pack light. Only what you can carry. And Anne, he hesitated. Your son will be frightened. He's been in the dark for 3 days. Be ready for that. Anne's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. The captain turned and walked back toward the throne room, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Anne stood alone in the corridor, gripping the key so tightly it dug into her skin. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she walked through the winding streets of the city, her mind racing. She had to think. Had to plan. Every detail mattered now. One mistake, and they'd both be lost. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. Vendors called out from their stalls, selling bread and cloth and candles. People laughed, argued, lived their ordinary lives. Anne felt like a ghost moving among them. How could the world keep turning when hers was falling apart? By the time she reached her small house on the edge of the city, the sun was beginning to set. The shadows were long and cold. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence hit her immediately. The house felt empty without her son. His books were still stacked on the table. His cloak hung by the door. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Anne sank into a chair and let herself cry. Just for a moment. Just long enough to release the pressure building in her chest. Then she wiped her eyes, stood, and got to work. She packed a small bag. Clothes, food, a pouch of coins she'd been saving. She wrapped the key in a cloth and tucked it into her boot. Then she sat by the window and waited. The hours crawled by. The city grew dark. Lanterns flickered to life in the streets. Anne watched the moon rise, pale and distant. She thought of her son. Was he cold? Hungry? Afraid? Did he know she was coming? When the church bells tolled midnight, Anne stood. Her hands were steady now. Her fear had hardened into resolve. She pulled her hood up, slipped out the back door, and disappeared into the night. The streets were empty. Only the night watch patrolled, and Anne knew their routes by heart. She kept to the shadows, moving quickly and silently. The castle loomed ahead, its towers black against the sky. She approached the servants' entrance. A young guard stood by the door, half asleep. Anne pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a loaf of bread she'd prepared earlier. "Delivery for the prisoners," she said quietly, keeping her head down. The guard barely looked at her. He waved her through. Anne's heart hammered as she stepped inside. The air was colder here, damp. The smell of mold and stone filled her lungs. She descended the narrow staircase, each step creaking under her weight. Torches lined the walls, casting long, flickering shadows. At the bottom, another guard sat at a desk, his head nodding. He was older, with a graying beard. Anne held her breath. "Food for the East Wing," she said softly. The guard grunted and waved her past without even looking up, and exhaled slowly. She moved deeper into the dungeons, counting the doors. 1, 2, 3. She stopped. Her hand trembled as she pulled the key from her boot. This was it. She slid the key into the lock. The metal scraped softly. The lock clicked open. Anne pushed the door, and it swung inward with a low creak. The cell was dark. The only light came from the torch in the corridor behind her, casting a faint glow into the small stone room. Anne's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas." She whispered. A figure stirred in the corner. Chains rattled. Then a voice, weak and disbelieving, spoke. "Mother." Anne's heart shattered. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands found his face in the darkness. He was thin. Too thin. His skin was cold and damp. "It's me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm getting you out." Thomas's arms wrapped around her and he began to cry. Deep, shaking sobs that tore through the silence. Anne held him tight, her own tears falling into his hair. "I thought he choked out. I thought they were going to kill me." "No," Anne said fiercely. "No, I won't let that happen. We're leaving. Right now." Shh. She pulled back and looked at him. Even in the dim light, she could see the fear in his eyes. The exhaustion. He was only 15. Just a boy. Anne reached for the shackles on his wrists. They were heavy iron, locked tight. She pulled out the key again, her hands shaking. It took 3 tries before she managed to unlock the first one. The metal cuff fell to the floor with a dull clang. Anne froze. The sound echoed through the dungeon. She held her breath, listening. No footsteps. No shouting. Just silence. She unlocked the second shackle. Thomas rubbed his wrists, wincing. Deep red marks circled his skin where the metal had bitten in. "Can you walk?" An asked Thomas nodded. "I think so." Anne helped him to his feet. He swayed, leaning on her for support. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders and guided him toward the door. They moved slowly, carefully. Every step felt like it might give them away. The corridor stretched ahead, long and shadowy. The sleeping guard was still at his desk, head slumped forward. Anne held her breath as they passed him. 1 step. 2, 3. The floor creaked under their weight. The guard stirred, muttering something in his sleep. Anne's heart stopped, but he didn't wake. They reached the staircase. Thomas gripped the railing, pulling himself up 1 step at a time. Anne stayed close, ready to catch him if he fell. The climb felt endless. Her legs burned. Her lungs ached. But she didn't stop. At the top, Anne pushed open the door. Cool night air rushed in. She glanced around. The young guard who'd let her in was gone, probably making his rounds. "Come on," she whispered. They slipped out into the courtyard. The castle was quiet. Most of the nobles were still at the banquet. Music and laughter drifted faintly from the great hall. Anne kept to the shadows, pulling Thomas along. They were halfway to the eastern gate when a voice rang out. "Stop!" Anne's blood turned to ice. She spun around. A guard stood 20 paces behind them, torch in hand. His face was young, his eyes wide with alarm. "Who goes there?" He called, raising his torch higher. Anne's mind raced. She couldn't run. Thomas was too weak. If they tried, the guard would raise the alarm, and it would be over. She stepped forward, keeping her hood up. "I'm taking my son to see a healer," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "He's ill." The guard squinted at them. "At this hour?" "It couldn't wait," Anne said. "Psst, please. He needs help." The guard hesitated. He looked at Thomas, who was pale and trembling. For a moment, Anne thought he might let them go, but then his eyes narrowed. "Wait, I know you. You're Lady Anne, the one who—" He didn't finish. A shadow moved behind him. There was a dull thud, and the guard crumpled to the ground. Captain Davos stood over him, holding the hilt of his sword. He looked at Anne, his expression grim. "Go," he said. Now Anne stared at him, her throat tight. "You," I said, "go." Davos hissed. "I'll deal with this. But you need to move. The gate is just ahead. My contact is waiting." Anne nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Davos didn't respond. He dragged the unconscious guard into the shadows, then turned back to her. "Run," he said quietly. Anne grabbed Thomas's hand and ran. They reached the eastern gate minutes later. A tall man stood by the door, dressed in the plain clothes of a gatekeeper. He looked up as they approached, his face unreadable. "Davos sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. Anne nodded, gasping for breath. The man pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked the gate. It swung open with a low groan. Beyond it, the road stretched into darkness, leading out of the city. "Follow the road east," the man said. "Don't stop until you reach the river. There's a ferryman there. Tell him the captain sent you. He'll take you across." Anne gripped his arm. "Thank you." The man's expression softened for a moment. "Go, before I change my mind." Anne pulled Thomas through the gate. The cool night air wrapped around them. Behind them, the city glowed with torchlight. Ahead, the road was dark and uncertain, but they were free. Anne didn't look back. She held her son's hand and ran into the night, leaving everything behind. They ran until their lungs burned. Until Thomas stumbled and nearly fell. Anne caught him, pulling him upright. "Just a little further," she whispered. "We're almost there." But then in the distance, a sound rose. Sharp and clear. The castle bells were ringing. The alarm had been raised, and somewhere behind them in the darkness, the hunt had begun. The bells echoed through the night, sharp and relentless. Anne's heart hammered in her chest. They had to move faster. But Thomas was barely staying on his feet. "Mother," he gasped, his voice weak. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Anne said firmly. She wrapped her arm around his waist, taking more of his weight. "We're not stopping. Not now." They stumbled forward, half running, half walking down the dark road. The trees on either side loomed like silent sentries. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made Anne's pulse spike. Behind them, voices rose in the distance, shouts, commands. The king's guards were coming. Anne's mind raced. How much time did they have? Minutes less? The river couldn't be far now. It couldn't be. Then she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats, faint at first, but growing louder, coming closer. "They're on horses," Thomas whispered, his voice tight with fear. Anne's stomach dropped. They couldn't outrun horses. Not on foot. Not with Thomas in this condition. She looked around desperately. The road was open, exposed. No place to hide. But then, through the darkness, she saw it. A narrow path leading off the road, disappearing into the trees. "This way," she hissed, pulling Thomas toward it. They crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks hidden in the dark. Thomas tripped, and Anne caught him before he hit the ground. "Keep moving," she urged. "Don't stop." The hoofbeats grew louder. Anne could hear the riders now, their voices calling to each other. Torches flickered through the trees behind them. Anne and Thomas pushed deeper into the forest. The path twisted and turned, narrowing until it was barely visible. Anne's legs burned. Her lungs screamed. But she didn't stop. Then suddenly, the ground dropped away. Anne skidded to a halt at the edge of a steep embankment. Below, she could hear it. The rush of water. The river. "We have to go down," she said. Thomas looked at the slope, his face pale. "Mother, I don't know if I can. You can," Anne said. She grabbed his hand. "Hold on to me. We'll do it together." They started down. The slope was steep and slippery, covered in loose dirt and dead leaves. Anne's feet slid out from under her and she fell hard, pulling Thomas with her. They tumbled down the embankment, rolling and sliding until they hit the bottom with a jarring thud. Anne groaned, pain shooting through her shoulder. She forced herself to her knees, looking around. They were at the riverbank. The water was dark and fast-moving, reflecting the faint moonlight. "Mother, are you hurt?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. "I'm fine," Anne lied. She pulled herself to her feet, wincing. "Come on. We need to find the ferryman." They stumbled along the bank, searching. The sound of the river was deafening, drowning out everything else. Anne's heart sank. What if the ferryman wasn't here? What if they were too late? Then she saw it. A small dock jutting out into the water, and tied to it, a flat-bottomed boat. A figure stood beside it, smoking a pipe. "Wait," Anne called out, her voice cracking. The man turned. He was old, with a weathered face and gray hair. He looked at them with tired, knowing eyes. "You the ones Davos sent?" he asked. Anne nodded, gasping for breath. "Please, we need to cross. Now." The man took a long draw from his pipe, studying them. Then he glanced back toward the forest. The torchlight was closer now. The voices louder. "Get in," he said quietly. Anne didn't hesitate. She helped Thomas into the boat, then climbed in after him. The old man untied the rope and pushed off from the dock. The boat rocked, then began to drift into the current. Anne looked back. Through the trees, she could see the torches, hear the riders crashing through the underbrush. Any second now, they'd reach the bank. The old man worked the oars, pulling them steadily across the river. The water was rougher than it looked. The boat rocked and swayed, but the ferryman's hands were steady. "Keep your heads down," he said quietly. Anne pulled Thomas close, shielding him with her body. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Then a voice rang out from the bank behind them. "There." "In the boat?" Anne's blood turned to ice. She looked back. A group of riders had reached the riverbank. One of them raised a bow, an arrow already knocked.
Get down."
The ferryman shouted. Anne threw herself over Thomas just as the arrow flew. It whistled past them, splashing into the water a few feet away. Another arrow followed, then another. The ferryman cursed, pulling harder on the oars. The boat surged forward, cutting through the water. "Hold on," he yelled. The current caught them, pulling the boat faster. The opposite bank was close now, so close. But the arrows kept coming, slicing through the air around them. One struck the side of the boat with a sharp crack. Water began to seep in through the splintered wood. "We're not going to make it," Thomas whispered. "Yes, we are," Anne said fiercely. She grabbed one of the oars and began to row alongside the ferryman. Her arms screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. The bank was 20 feet away, then 10. The boat was sinking now, water pouring in faster. Anne's feet were soaked. The cold bit into her skin. "Jump," the ferryman shouted. Anne grabbed Thomas and leaped. They hit the water hard, the cold stealing her breath. She kicked upward, pulling Thomas with her. Her feet found the muddy bottom, and she dragged him toward the shore. They collapsed on the bank, coughing and gasping. The ferryman pulled the sinking boat onto the sand, then turned to them. "Go," he said. "You're across the border now. They can't follow. But don't linger." Anne looked back across the river. The riders stood on the opposite bank, silhouetted against the torchlight. One of them shouted, but the words were lost in the rush of the water. Anne pulled Thomas to his feet. They were soaking wet, shivering and exhausted. But they were alive, and they were free. They walked for hours through unfamiliar land. The forest here was different, thicker, wilder. The trees grew close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moon. Anne kept one hand on Thomas's shoulder, guiding him through the darkness. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They were too exhausted, too overwhelmed. Every step was an act of will. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Anne finally allowed them to stop. They found a small clearing, sheltered by rocks and dense brush. Anne sank to the ground, her body aching everywhere. Thomas collapsed beside her, his eyes closing immediately. Within seconds, he was asleep. Anne watched him, her heart heavy. His face was pale, bruised. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. But he was breathing. He was safe. She allowed herself a moment to cry, silent tears that she didn't have the strength to hold back anymore. Everything she'd known was gone. Her home, her life, the city she'd lived in her entire life, but none of that mattered. Not compared to this. Her son was alive. As the sun rose higher, Anne forced herself to stay awake. She needed to keep watch, to make sure no one had followed, but the forest remained quiet, peaceful. Birds sang in the trees. A deer wandered past, pausing to look at them before moving on. Hours later, Thomas stirred. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the sunlight filtering through the branches. "Mother?" he said quietly. Anne reached out and touched his face. "I'm here." Thomas sat up, looking around. "We made it," he whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it untrue. "We did," Anne said. She managed a small smile. "We're safe now." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." "Stop," Anne said gently. She pulled him into her arms. "None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? You did nothing wrong." Thomas cried then, deep shaking sobs that had been building for days. Anne held him, letting him release it all. The fear, the confusion, the guilt. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer. "What do we do now?" he asked. Anne took a breath. She'd been asking herself the same question all night. "We start over," she said simply. "We find a village, a town, somewhere far from here. We'll use different names. Build a new life. Will they come looking for us?" "Maybe," Anne admitted, "but we're across the border now. And the king has bigger problems than chasing us. Eventually, he'll have to let it go." "What about Captain Davos? Will he be okay?" Anne's chest tightened. She thought of the captain, the man who'd risked everything to help them. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But he made his choice. He wanted to do the right thing. We have to honor that by living the life he gave us." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was brave. "Yes," Anne agreed. "He was." They sat together in the clearing as the morning stretched on. Anne opened the bag she'd packed, pulling out bread and dried meat. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. "Mother," Thomas said after a while. "Yes. Thank you. For coming for me." Anne's throat tightened. "I would have torn down the castle stone by stone to get to you," she said. "There is nothing in this world that would have stopped me." Thomas smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was there. And for the first time in days, Anne felt a flicker of hope. They rested for most of the day, letting their bodies recover. When the sun began to set, they packed up and started walking again. This time, the journey felt different. Less frantic. Less desperate. They followed a narrow trail that wound through the forest, heading east. Toward the unknown. Toward whatever came next. 3 days later, they reached a small village nestled in a valley. It was peaceful, quiet. The people were farmers, tradesmen, simple folk who didn't ask too many questions. Anne and Thomas rented a small cottage on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a fireplace, but it was theirs. Anne found work at the local market, selling bread. Thomas helped at the blacksmith's forge, learning the trade. They kept to themselves mostly, speaking little of their past. At night, Anne would sit by the fire and watch Thomas. He was different now, older. The fear in his eyes had faded, replaced by something quieter. Wisdom, maybe, or resilience. Months passed, then a year. The seasons changed. Winter came and went, then spring. One evening, as they sat together eating dinner, Thomas looked up at Anne. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Regret what?" "Leaving. Giving up everything." Anne set down her spoon. She thought about it. Truly thought about it. Her old life felt like a distant dream now. A story that had happened to someone else. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. Not for a second." Thomas smiled. "Good," he said quietly. "Because I don't either." Anne reached across the table and took his hand. "We're going to be okay," she said. Better than okay. And in that small cottage, far from the throne room and the dungeons and the life they'd left behind, Anne believed it. They had lost everything. But they'd found something far more valuable: freedom, peace, and each other. And that was enough. The storm had passed. And in its wake, they'd built something new. Something better. A life worth living.